I now call to order the Society's 2,476th meeting in what is now the 152nd year since its founding on March 13th, 1871. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. My name is Larry Milstein. I am the president of PSW, one of the oldest scientific societies of Washington, D.C., committed to providing a forum to further scientific understanding and inquiry. Welcome to our members, guests, and friends, including everyone here in the Powell Auditorium at the Cosmos Club and everyone tuning in on YouTube, to tonight's lecture by Amanda Podany. The Society is grateful to PSW full year series sponsors, PSW Mike Helton and Helton Associates, and the Policy Studies Organization in cooperation with the American Public University. We are also grateful to the PSW Spring Lecture Series sponsor, PSW member Tim Thomas, and to the sponsors of tonight's lecture, PSW member Brad Calvin, and PSW members Robin Taylor and Larry Milstein. Speaking of sponsors, as mentioned at the last meeting and the one before that and the one before that and the one before that, the Society is involved in a fundraising campaign to make sure that we'll be able to meet expenses in the coming years, especially looking at the much higher prices for facilities we use at the Cosmos Club. I'm pleased to report that we did reach our goal for this fiscal year, primarily due to a few very, very generous sponsors. Giving, as many of you may know, follows a power law, also known fondly as the 80-20 law, in which 20% of the donors give 80% of the donations. If you are interested in supporting PSW and you want to continue to grow and to provide these lectures free of charge to the public, live streamed and recorded and online, available for everybody, please contribute as much as you can. And even if you can't yourself, let us know if you know of anybody who might be interested to contribute and support the Society. And after that begging, we'll go. If you are not a PSW member, I will further beg you to join. It's easy to do. You just go to the PSW homepage and go to the upper right-hand corner and look for the join button and press that and then follow the menu and the prompts, and you can be a member. We welcome new members. We love new members. All new members are entitled to wear the PSW rosette. These can be purchased online, but they must be picked up here. So I am pleased to announce the following new members. John Sullivan, Business Development Manager for Architecture and Civil Engineering Design Software, retired from Autodesk. Interested in a wide variety of subjects in science, who learned a PSW from a Google search. Koichi Ai, diplomat, currently minister and head of chancellery of the Embassy of Japan, interested in biochemistry, particle physics, and astronomy, who learned a PSW at an event at the Cosmos Club. Ed Tacken, research scientist, retired from the Naval Research Laboratory, interested in environmental factors in human health, particularly food additives, who learned a PSW from PSW member Al Ehrlich. Andrew Gunn, a process integration engineer with Northrop Grumman Corporation, interested in semiconductor devices, who learned a PSW from PSW member Robin Taylor. Dietrich Foster, an astronomer with the United States Naval Observatory, interested in astronomy and cosmology, physics, and mathematics, who learned a PSW from a colleague. And tonight's speaker, Amanda Podany, who learned a PSW from the invitation to speak here tonight, and whose interests will be clear in part, small part, from tonight's lecture. We welcome them all to membership, I mentioned before, if you're not a member, please join. See? Join now. And purchase a rosette. And in addition to that, all new members and all members who previously joined but didn't actually get one are entitled to a signed copy of Volume 1 of the PSW Bulletin. And if you did not get your copy, or you're a new member and you'd like your copy, please see me after the lecture, and I will be happy to provide it. Recording Secretary Camille Lance will now present the minutes of the 2475th meeting and the lecture by Jonathan Losos on using experiments in nature to study evolution, research on lizard island adaptations in real time. Cameo, the stage is yours.
Thank you kindly, Larry. Hello, everyone. On March 31st, 2023, from the Powell Auditorium of the Cosmos Club in Washington, D.C., and by Zoom webinar broadcast on the PSW YouTube Science channel, President Larry Milstein called together the 2475th meeting of the Society to order at 8:02 p.m. He welcomed new members, and the recording secretary read the minutes of the previous meeting. President Milstein then introduced the speaker for the evening, Jonathan Losos, Director of the Living Earth Collaborative at the Washington University. His lecture was titled, Using Experiments in Nature to Study Evolution. The speaker began his talk on evolutionary biology by highlighting experimental work of Charles Darwin. Although Darwin made significant contributions to science, Loso argued that he was also wrong about certain things, such as the pace of evolution, which he thought was very slow. The speaker pointed out that we now know that evolutionary change can occur rapidly under certain conditions, as demonstrated by laboratory studies on fruit flies. Losos suggested that understanding the mechanisms that drive rapid evolution can help us address a range of issues, from antibiotic resistance to climate change. Losos went on to discuss his experimental field of studies of evolution in the Bahamas. The speaker significantly discussed his research on lizards in the genus Anolis and how they adapt to different environments. His team noticed that on a very small island in the Bahamas, you did not find these lizards. The Shanners, who were conducting an experiment, introduced populations of these lizards to the small islands to watch them go extinct. However, the lizards did not go extinct, and this finding set the stage for further research on the evolution of leg length in lizard species. The speaker then discussed his research on adaptation to different environments, the role of intraspecific competition between species in driving evolution, the role of predation, and the founder effect. The speaker acknowledged that this research was a collaborative effort and thanked his collaborators. Losos then described a set of studies looking at the effect of exercise on limb growth, where various animals, such as mice, rats, and chickens, were made to exercise and their limb characteristics were measured. The researchers conducted their own experiment with baby brown and Holes lizards, growing them in two different situations, on broad and narrow surfaces, and found that the lizards grew on the broad surface had longer legs than the ones on the narrow surfaces. This demonstrated that there is a component of phenotypic plasticity of the limb length to how an organism grows. Losos went on to discuss their experiment where they introduced lizards to small islands with a single male and female and observed their adaptation to the new environment. They found that the populations grew quickly and inbreeding was not a problem. They also measured the genetic variation of the lizards and used X-ray machines to measure their legs, which was more accurate than measuring them by hand. The experiment showed that the founder effect theory holds true, and that evolution can occur rapidly in new populations with a small number of individuals. Losos then concluded with an encore in which he briefly described the work that has been done in his lab by postdoctoral students. Next, the question and answer period began. One of the members asked how many generations were being considered with the studies. Losos responded that there are approximately 2 generations per year, and some of the studies occurred over about 10 or 11-year period, so generally 16 to 20 generations per study. Another member asked if we have a better understanding of which characteristics are predominantly phenotypic plasticity versus those that are clearly genetic. The answer states that while phenotypic plasticity has become an important topic of research in the last 20 years, it is difficult to categorize traits as purely plastic or purely genetic, because plasticity itself is a genetic phenomenon. Most traits exist on a spectrum between plasticity and genetic influence. However, modern genomic technology allows us to better understand the mechanisms of plasticity and how it interacts with the genes. Therefore, Losos concludes that while there is no discrete categories, it is an exciting time for the research on plasticity. After the question and answer period, President Milstein thanked the speaker, made the usual housekeeping announcements, and invited guests to join the society. President Milstein adjourned the meeting at 9:52 p.m. The temperature in Washington, D.C. was 6 degrees Celsius. The weather was cloudy. Attendance in the Powell Auditorium was 44, and concurrently on YouTube was 24, for a total in-person attendance of 68. The number of online viewers in the first 2 weeks of posting was 226. Respectfully submitted, Recording Secretary, Cameo Lance. Thank you.
Thank you, Cameo. Are there any comments or corrections on the minutes? Hearing none, I will entertain a motion to accept the minutes as read. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Al. Do I have a second? Thank you, Al. All in favor? All members opposed? The minutes are accepted as read and will be posted to the website in due course. We now turn to tonight's lecture, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Amanda Podany and her lecture on ancient lives preserved in cuneiform, impressions of Mesopotamian society over 3,500 years ago. Amanda is Professor Emeritus of History at Cal Poly Pomona, where she has been on the faculty since 1990. Her research focuses on life in ancient Mesopotamia, particularly in the 2nd millennium BCE, with attention to chronology, scribal practice, international relations, and kingship. Much of her work has centered on the land of Hana, located in the Middle Euphrates region. Among other notable contributions, Amanda helped pioneer the use of microhistory to study cuneiform archives, exploring and contextualizing the lives of ancient individuals. She's an author on numerous scholarly articles and 5 books. She's also the author and lecturer in a 24-part Great Courses series on ancient Mesopotamia. Now on the service renamed as Wondrium, which I think they should have stuck with Great Courses, but that's me. Anyway, I highly recommend the series. It's quite wonderful and informative. Her latest book is Weavers, Scribes, and Kings, A New History of the Ancient Near East, centering on the lives of some of the people who lived there several thousand years before us. She's been the recipient of numerous awards, including the Hundley Award from the American Historical Association for her book, Brotherhood of Kings, and her book, Weavers, Scribes, and Kings, was recently selected as a finalist for a Prose Award from the Association of American Publishers. Amanda earned a BA in Anthropology at UCLA, an MA in Archaeology of Western Asia at the Institute of Archaeology, University of London, and a PhD in History of the Ancient Near East at UCLA. All questions will be fielded after the lecture during the Q&A session. Amanda, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Larry. And thank you all for being here, and thank you who are online and viewing with us here as well. So as Larry said, my talk tonight is called Ancient Lives Preserved in Cuneiform, and it pertains to Mesopotamian people who, as the subtitle suggests, lived more than 3,500 years ago. Now, this seems like a very long time ago, and you might suppose that we know very little about these ancient lives. But in fact, the tablets from the region, inscribed in the cuneiform script, provide us with a wealth of details, both about communities and about specific individuals, and not all of them powerful. One problem, though, is that known cuneiform documents are unevenly spread across the 3,000 years of Mesopotamian history. For example, one 13-year period during the 18th century BCE in one Syrian city, the city of Mari, can be reconstructed in incredible detail. We know the names, the concerns, and even the personalities of hundreds of people. But many other periods are a complete blank. The classic image that comes to mind about this is that of a huge warehouse, lit only by spotlights. All of Mesopotamian history is in that warehouse, but what we know of it is only where those spotlights are shining. Tonight, what I'm going to show you is how we can start to spread the spotlights a little wider, by learning everything we can from the materials that survive. Now, I should note, the people living in the region that is now Iraq and Syria, in the period starting in 3500 BCE, when urban culture first developed there, they didn't think that they were living at the beginning of history. Not at all. They believed that their civilization was already inconceivably old. This document that you see on the slide is known as the Sumerian King List, and it was written about 4,000 years ago, and it lists all the ages of humankind that had come before them, according to their belief, and it includes lists of reigns and kingdoms that added up to 400,000 years of civilization that had preceded their time. They believed that some of the earliest kings lived for tens of thousands of years, which kind of filled in the time. But we, of course, know that they were completely wrong. The earliest cities had in fact arisen less than 2,000 years before the king list was written down, not 400,000 years. And the first kings had taken the throne just 1,000 years before, around 2900 BCE. It's very telling that they had no idea that they were so relatively new to urban culture and government. It just seems so deeply rooted to them. It was so intrinsic to their universe that they transported its origins to an impossibly distant time. So as a result, the Mesopotamians didn't think of themselves as living in ancient history any more than we do. Everything in their time was as modern and innovative as they could imagine. People back then were just as smart and complicated as we are today. They spoke languages that had been developing for thousands of years, and they could express any idea that came into their heads. They were real individuals who lived and loved and suffered and believed and laughed. And we know so much about them because their documents survive in greater numbers than from any other ancient culture. This is true of all of ancient Mesopotamian history, from the beginnings of writing around 3100 BCE to around the time of Alexander of Macedon in the 4th century BCE. Like the king list seen here, most of the Mesopotamian texts were written on clay, and they preserve countless details about ancient life. Museums and collections around the world house at least 500,000 of these clay tablets, covered in words written in their wedge-shaped cuneiform script. Almost certainly, millions more still lie in the ground awaiting discovery. But I have only an hour, so I can't possibly give you even the most superficial overview of all of the contents of these tablets. Instead, tonight, I'm going to begin by introducing you to a single cuneiform tablet, and we're going to look at what it reveals about history and society when viewed in the context of other documents from the same area or the same time. And I'll show you how a little pool of light in that huge warehouse of Mesopotamian history has been switched on and expanded. But first, we need to find out where in the warehouse it belongs. This tablet has to be anchored in place and time. The museum number of this tablet is VAT 6685, and it has been in the Vorderasiatische Museum in Berlin since it was first published in 1909. As you can see here, initially only a hand-drawn copy was printed of the tablet. Few people but the scholar who published it would have known what it actually looked like. This autograph copy, as it's called, was useful for someone who could read cuneiform, In 1909, it was very hard to read from photographs in publications, so autograph copies were the norm. But one gets no sense of the tablet's appearance, or even of the handwriting of the scribe. Even from the autograph copy, though, and even before the tablet's date was certain, one could see that it recorded a contract, and it had a story to tell. Now, I should point out, because you're looking at cuneiform, and some of you can't read it, that the Mesopotamians wrote from left to right, like we do, and from top to bottom. So you would read it just the way you would read a text in English today, in terms of following the lines the way that they are. And the top of the left-hand side is the obverse of the text, and the right-hand side of the slide is the reverse. And it starts out with a description of some fields. It goes on to some legal clauses pertaining to these fields, which were described as being given to someone. And then it goes on to more legal clauses on the back. And then the last part, where you can see there's a sign and then a lot of very similar looking lines, that's the list of the witnesses. And at the very end, there's a date. So it's constructed as you might imagine a legal contract would be. So here's what we know from this tablet. Many centuries ago, somewhere in the Middle East, and at this point the author, I will not yet reveal what the author found out, a group of very eminent men gathered in a city called Terka for a formal occasion. Many of them no doubt knew one another and had worked together regularly. Here, in the list of witnesses, was Bina Ishtar, the governor of the region, along with Guri, who was the top general, who might also have been the crown prince. All kinds of ministers and chancellors were there as witnesses to this transaction, including someone with the title the overseer of the people, and another man who was the overseer of merchants. 14 such men in all, along with a scribe named Huzani, who was present to draw up a record of the event. All their names were listed. The local king, whose name was Ami Madar, was almost certainly in attendance as well, because the reason for the gathering was that he was donating 3 large fields, totaling what they said 51 iku in their measuring system, which is about 45 acres in ours, to a man. And the man's name was Pagirum, and he was described as the king's servant. Now, people back then had no surnames. They were distinguished when they were being referred to, either by their profession or by their father's name. And Pagirum isn't listed as having a profession, he's listed as being the son of a man named Bakilum. And I want you just to remember Pagirum's name, because it's going to come up a lot. So Pagirum, I realize there's a lot of names, right? And they're ancient, unfamiliar names. So bear with me, you don't have to memorize all of them. Just keep Pagirum's name in your mind. So we know quite a bit about the fields that Pagirum received from the king. One, which was by far the biggest, was described as being bordered by swampy land on 2 sides. So I've got you, this is some swampy land in Mesopotamia in the picture. But on the other 2 sides, there were fields. And one of these fields belonged to a woman, and the other was described as belonging to the palace. A second, much smaller field was flanked by palace fields on 3 sides, and this was also true of the third, which was just 3.5 acres in extent. Both of the smaller fields were described as being in the region of Terka. The palace seems to have owned quite a lot of fields in this area. Huzani, the scribe, wrote down all these details about the locations and sizes of the fields, and he also noted that the principal parties had sworn a solemn oath to abide by the contract. They swore in the names of 3 gods, Shamash, who was the sun god of all of Mesopotamia, Dagon, who was a god of the Middle Euphrates region, he was a god of grain, and a god named Iturmer, who was a city god. And also they swore in the name of the king. The scribe noted that these are incontestable fields which are free from claims or release. So these were now Pagirum's property. No one else could claim them, and even if a royal release were to be proclaimed, which would have served to cancel many debts, still no one but Pagirum would have a right to the fields. Someone else who tried to make a claim to the fields, and I quote, "will pay 10 minas of silver to the palace, and hot asphalt will be smeared on his head." Now, a mina was about equivalent to the weight of a modern pound, so 10 pounds of silver was an impossibly large sum to have paid in a fine, especially since silver wasn't found in Mesopotamia natively, had to be imported. And the threat of that hot asphalt must have been a serious disincentive as well. So Huzani must have learned how to draw up a contract like this when he attended a local scribal school. He had also learned how to list witnesses to the contract, those 14 eminent men, in this case, along with his own name at the end of the list. He noted, too, that the governor had received a shekel of silver for his services, that's about a quarter of an ounce, as had the scribe himself. And he knew to date the document at the end. It was, he wrote, the 6th day of the month Canaan, in the year when King Amimadar had ascended the throne of his father. Now, in this era, and there were many eras like this in Mesopotamia, the kings named their years rather than numbering them. That was normal. The scribe asked 5 people to roll their cylinder seals on the margin of the contract, perhaps even including the king. Cylinder seals function very much like signatures. They were a little piece of sort of bead made of stone, and it had a sort of design carved into it in reverse, in mirror image, so that when you rolled it on clay, you got sort of a frieze of images. And they used these when they needed to do what we would think of as signing a document. Unfortunately, though, Huzani didn't record the names of any of the owners of the seals that had impressed the seals on the margin. Now, we know all these details about this day, which was the 6th of Canaan, because they're beautifully preserved on this little clay tablet. It measures only 6.8 centimeters by 13.3 centimeters, or 2 2/3 by 5 1/4 inches. I think one of the common misconceptions is that Mesopotamians wrote on stone. They didn't. They mostly wrote on clay. And the clay tablets are very small. This is, many of them are absolutely minute. So they would easily fit in your hand. And of course, that makes sense for the scribe who was writing them. This one certainly would have. And as I say, it provides a lot of names. We, in fact, have a total of 25 people named on the text that we've been talking about, which included not just Pagirum and the king and the witnesses, but also the names of the owners of the nearby fields, the parents of the fathers of many of the people as well, and those 3 gods. So I'm sure, though, at this point, you have a number of questions. One is, where was Terka? So we know it's from Terka. Where was Terka? When did this transaction take place? That is, what date in our calendar is the 1st year of King Amimadar's reign? For that matter, what's the name of Amimadar's kingdom? What else did he do during his reign? Who was Pagirum, and why did he warrant this gift of land? Did he have to do anything for the king in exchange? Did anyone ever really have hot asphalt poured on their head? Actually, I can answer that one. As far as we know, we have no evidence that it was ever done. I don't have this in my notes, but just so that you know, because I know you're worried, right? I mean, I would be too. But there is no record of it ever actually taking place. And what about those other officials? Is this all we know about them? Just that they were present on one particular day to witness one particular royal bequest? Now, I can answer that question right away. For almost every one of these men and one woman, this document is the only trace of them that has been found, not just by 1909 when it was published, but to date. They had whole eventful lives, right? They were brought up by their parents. They got married, perhaps. They had a profession. They found favor with the king. They had arguments with their neighbors. They learned to play the lute. They had lives, and yet all we know about them, all of that is lost. All we know about them is that sometimes we know their father's name, sometimes we know their title, we know they perhaps owned a field, but other than that, all we know is they spent a few hours together on one day to witness a royal gift of land. I have to say, though, at least we have their names, right? Think about all the billions of people who've lived on Earth who we have no record of at all. So these people, I think, they came down to us. We're talking about them tonight. Anyway, but I still feel bad. I would like to know more. But there is one exception on this tablet to this sort of anonymity, and that is Pagirum, the man who received the field. And he, for a while after this was published, seemed oddly ubiquitous, as you will see. So the questions I just posed must also have spun through the mind of a scholar named Arthur Ungnad in 1909 when he first published this tablet in an article in the 6th volume of the journal Beiträge zur Assyriologie. He had answers for very few of the questions, and we still can't answer many of them. This is often the case for the ancient world. It's rarely true in the study of more recent periods of history. Normally, a stray document, separated from its provenance or original archive, can be placed with relative certainty into its historical context. But not so for the ancient world. Cuneiform writing was used for so long, for 3,000 years, in fact more than 3,000 years, and over such a wide area, that even though we have 500,000 cuneiform tablets, we know that we're missing a lot, possibly even whole kingdoms that simply haven't come to light yet. They existed, we talk about these people having been remembered by one tablet. Entire kingdoms seem to be missing from our documentation. And that that is true probably of kings as well. And so, for example, King Amimadar, for example, is similar to the other men listed here in that he is only known from this one tablet and one other one where he's listed as the father of the subsequent king. All the evidence for his whole reign, his very existence, for now, is recorded basically here. In Art History Warehouse, think about that big dark warehouse, there is just a pinprick of light around King Amimadar at this point. But in contrast, some ancient reigns in Mesopotamia are known from thousands of documents. For example, when a king named Ishar-Damu and his wife Tabor-Damu were ruling in the city of Ebla, which is also in Syria, around 2300 BCE, their palace was attacked and burned to the ground. No one went back to recover their archives. They were simply left there in the ruins, untouched, until they were found by archaeologists in the 1980s. You can see the tablets here, some of them, especially the ones on the right, that are still lined up in the same order in which they had been stored on shelves 4,300 years ago. As a result, we know a great deal about Ishar-Damu and Tabor-Damu, the economy of their palace, their diplomatic relations with other lands, and so much more. I should point out here that these tablets, the Sumerian king list, Pagirum's contract, the archive at Ebla, and all the rest, like these tablets found together in a jar at a site called Basetki, have only survived because they were written on clay. Had the Mesopotamians used a different organic medium, such as papyrus, parchment, leather, or palm leaves for their writing, almost none of their documents would still be readable today. Most would have disintegrated to such an extent that we wouldn't even know a document had ever existed. This is true of the writings of most of the Mesopotamians' ancient neighbors. We are very lucky that they wrote on clay. Every document that survives is a message from the ancient world, and that includes both documents that were designed to last, like royal inscriptions, which were often carved on stone, and ones that were the equivalent of papers in a modern filing cabinet, written for a particular purpose at a particular time, but with no eye to the future. This jar of tablets is just an ancient file folder. But finding where a single document fits into the big picture of the ancient Middle East was and is a detective story, and one that ends up giving us a surprisingly rich picture of the past. Arthur Ugnad was 30 years old when he published Pagirum's contract in 1909. He had recently become a professor at the very venerable University of Greifswald in northern Germany. In 1906, he had published a grammar of the ancient Akkadian language that was a standard reference work for decades in my field. He is a big name. So he wrote this brief publication of Pagirum's contract, and he provided a little information about its recent background. A German scholar named Friedrich Saar had purchased it from an unnamed merchant in the Syrian city of Deir ez-Zor. And I have to say, this is actually from like the 1920s. I couldn't find a 1909 picture of Deir ez-Zor, but close. Deir ez-Zor is located on the Euphrates River in eastern Syria. The merchant told Saar that the tablet had come from Rakhba. Ugnad realized that another earlier tablet that had mentioned Terka had come from just that same region, a site called Tel Ashara, just a few miles downstream from Rakhba. Ugnad wondered, in print, whether the ancient site of Terka might have been located at Tel Ashara. Plenty of subsequent evidence has proved him right. Terka mentioned in the tablets was indeed Tel Ashara, which you can make out a little bit more clearly on this modern map. And you can see that it's just a few miles from the Syrian border with Iraq. You can see that in the cutout map there. The modern village of Ashara sits on top of an occupation mound, which is called a tell in Arabic, where the great city of Terka was located in ancient times. All the dirt in this tell, all of that entire hill that you see in the picture, results from human habitation. The accumulation of mud brick walls, floors, streets, and trash for thousands of years. This seems to have been where Pagirum received his gift of land from King Amimadar. I should just mention, this is why archaeologists in the Middle East can always tell where to excavate, because the tells stand up from the surrounding landscape, and they are always just full of evidence of human occupation. The question is always which eras of human occupation are represented. And Tel Ashara, interestingly, is largely ancient with the modern village on the top, but there's not a lot of intermediate material from, say, Roman or Islamic period. So, having proposed a provenance for the tablet, Ungnad moved on to try to determine the name of Amimadar's kingdom. He looked at other publications of cuneiform tablets from Syria, searching for references to Terka, and he found another one. It was in a clay tablet that had been published in 1897, 12 years earlier, by a scholar named François Toureau d'Angin, which recorded a similar gift of property in Terka. In this case, the contract was for a house given by a different king to a different man. But again, it was a gift. It was a royal gift. In this tablet, the king was named Ishar-lim, and with great good luck, his royal seal was impressed on the tablet, and the royal seal had his title, and his title was King of Hana. So here was the name of the kingdom, Hana. It was an almost unknown kingdom at the time, its name mentioned only in this tablet that Toureau d'Angin had published. Ungnad speculated that Terka might have been the capital city of Hana. So when was the kingdom of Hana? Now we have where it is, but when was it? A third cuneiform tablet that Ungnad read about, a marriage contract this time, seemed to hold the answer. It had been published 2 years earlier, in 1907, by a British scholar named Reverend Claude Johns. It shared a number of features in common with the tablet that Toureau d'Angin had published, and, again in a stroke of luck, it mentioned a city called Fort Ishar-lim. Now you remember Ishar-lim was the name of the king in the previous tablet, so Fort Ishar-lim seems to have been probably a city built by King Ishar-lim, the king of Hana. So Johns concluded in his publication that this tablet too must have been from the kingdom of Hana. When Johns published the marriage contract, he had written that he had no idea of the physical location where the tablet had been found, but he noted that it was dated to the reign of a king named Hammurapi. Now, Hammurapi has an extra H on the end, Hammurapi, and it has a P instead of a B, but was this Hammurabi of Babylon? The sign for B and P were often the same, so it could have been read but either way. So, Hammurabi, there's a familiar name. In 1902, just 5 years before Johns published the marriage contract from Hana, this spectacular stone stele had been excavated in Susa, in what is now Iran, topped with an image of King Hammurabi of Babylon on the left and the sun god Shamash on the right. Its discovery made headlines in newspapers because the text that covered the rest of the monument, and it's hard to see in this image, but the text, there's cuneiform all over the stele. The text that covered the rest of the stele was comprised of laws, hundreds of them. And they concluded the origin of written law had been found. Actually, it hadn't. We now have evidence that laws had been written more than 300 years before Hammurabi's time. But Hammurabi entered the history books and he became a household name, and he has never stopped being one. So Hammurabi ruled Babylon from 1792 to 1750 BCE. Not only was he not actually the first lawgiver, he wasn't the first king to try to create and hold on to an empire. That had been the boast of Sargon of Akkad 600 years before. But towards the end of Hammurabi's 43-year reign, he had conquered most of Mesopotamia. From the Gulf, let me see if I can get this to work, from the Gulf down here, all the way up to, I'm not very good at this. Oh, okay, I'm not even going to try. I'm going to go back. I need to go back. There we go, okay. So you can see on the map, you see where I have Terka circled? He conquered all the way up to Mari, which is just to the south of Terka. Johns himself, so Johns is publishing this text dated to a king named Hammurapi. He was dubious that Hammurapi was the same man as the king of Babylon. Many features of the marriage contract seemed wrong. The script, the month name, the type of contract, the legal formulas, nothing like them was known from other texts from the time of Hammurabi. The tablet's date included a year name, but even the year name wasn't one of the ones known from the reign of Hammurabi of Babylon. John's caution, actually, in this regard was well-founded, as it turned out. But Ungnad, in 1909, when he published Pagurum's contract, with which we began this tale, he had no qualms about this. He was sure King Hammurapi, in whose reign the marriage contract had been drawn up, was the same man as Hammurabi of Babylon. Here, he thought, was more evidence for that era. Hammurabi of Babylon must have conquered the region around Terka, that hadn't been discovered before, but perhaps he had, after the time of King Ishar-lim of Hana, and had he'd built his empire as far as Terka. Incredibly, one more piece of evidence tied these three documents together. There was just one witness to that marriage contract from the time of Hammurapi, and his name was Pagirum. See, I told you you needed to remember that name. It was an unusual name. It hadn't been found in many cuneiform tablets before this. Surely, Ungnad reasoned, this must have been the same man who was given a field by King Amimadar. He wrote, and I'm translating from the German, if Pagyrum in Johns's document is identical to our Pagyrum, then VAT 6685, Pagyrum's contract, probably belongs shortly before the time of the conquest of Hana by Babylon, in the time of Hammurabi. Now, all this is totally understandable. There were only 3 tablets known from this region, and they shared features in common. One of them named the kingdom, 2 of them seemed to have been about the same man, Pagyrum, and one was dated to a king who might have been Hammurabi of Babylon. Given the available evidence, Ungnad's conclusions made sense. In 1909, very shortly after Ungnad had published Pagyrum's contract, another related text was published, again by François Toureau d'Agen, who had first identified the kingdom of Hana. It dated to another new king, a man named Kashtiliashu, and it had some features that had come to be seen as distinctive of a Hana text, such as the reference to hot asphalt being smeared on the head of someone who reneged on the contract. Incredibly, too, here was a connection to the first 3. The contract pertains to the sale of a field, and the buyer's name was Bakilum. You may remember that this was the name of Pagyrum's father. So, the family of a man named Pagyrum seemed to have had a role in 3 of the 4 known contracts that shared features and had been characterized as being from Hana. He was the recipient of a gift of land in the first text we discussed from the reign of Amimadar. He was a witness to another contract from the reign of Hammurabi, and a man named Bakilum, who, that was the name of his father, was the buyer of 2 fields in the 3rd tablet from the reign of Kashtiliashu. Only the land grant from Esharlim didn't mention anyone related to Pagyrum, but it included other shared features that put it into the same group. These were the unusual legal expressions, which I've listed here on this chart. First, land changing hands was described as natsbum, that's a term in Akkadian, and it's an unusual term actually, and it could not be reclaimed in the case of a debt release decree, for example. Also, in 3 of the 4 contracts, someone reneging on the contract had the hot asphalt punishment. In 1909, these phrases had not been found elsewhere, only on these 4 tablets. Now, none of these tablets was formally excavated. They had all been purchased, so scholars had no idea exactly where they had come out of the ground. But all 4 had appeared in museum collections within a decade of one another, and they had many shared features, as we've seen. Toureau d'Agen began to wonder if they might originally have all been found in the ground together, perhaps in an archive belonging to Pagyrum. This, too, was an understandable conclusion. The corollary that was reached at the time was that all 4 of the kings named in the texts presumably ruled within 2 generations when Pagyrum and his father were alive, and if Hammurabi was the same as the king of Babylon, then this was all before or during the 18th century BCE. Many scholars agreed with Ungnad on this, and it seemed that the kingdom of Hana had a reliable date. It had been put on a timeline, and it stayed right there for decades. Here is where it was. As you can see from this chart, of the major eras of the 2nd millennium BCE, this era is known as the Old Babylonian period. It was a time when literacy became more widespread, though most people were still illiterate. Private enterprise began to flourish, and many more cuneiform tablets tend to be found in private houses. In earlier periods, the temples and palaces seem to have largely monopolized the use of writing. The Old Babylonian period ended in 1595 BCE and was followed by a Dark Age. What happened in 1595 was Babylon was conquered, and so that marks the end of the Old Babylonian period. And in turn, after the Dark Age, we have the Late Bronze Age, during which several great powers, Babylonia, Egypt, Hatti, Mitanni, and later Assyria, dominated the ancient Middle East and largely cooperated peacefully through diplomacy. Now, we're going to leave the early 20th century and speed forward to the early 1980s. And I need to add myself to this story at this point, because this was when I began working on my PhD, and I ended up writing my dissertation on these documents, including Pagyurum's contract. And I have to say, I've been writing about them ever since. It's been a long time. So I enrolled in the PhD program in ancient Near Eastern history at UCLA, and in 1983, I headed to the site of Terka in Syria with fellow grad students and the excavation team under the direction of Giorgio Bucciolati, who was also my doctoral advisor, and his wife, archaeologist Marilyn Kelly Bucciolati from Cal State Los Angeles. Their international team had been excavating at Terka since 1976, so ours was the 8th season. By the early 80s, it had become clear that the ancient kingdom of Hana, which Terka might have been the capital of, had extended north from Terka up the Habur River, as shown here. The modern town of Ashara, located on top of the ruins of the ancient city of Terka, complicated the site's excavation a little. The archaeologists could only work in areas where there were no streets or houses, mostly at the edge of the tell and in the town park. You can see Ashara in the foreground of this image, with the Euphrates flowing past and the fields beyond it. And the fields would have been laid out very much the same in ancient times, the long, narrow fields that you see here. Now, this map shows the ancient paths of the Euphrates, and the modern path of the Euphrates has a dark line, but the ancient paths that the Euphrates took have these dotted lines. And you can see where I've circled Ashara and Terka, you can see where the ancient tell used to be. And what you can see is that the tell used to be circular, but as the river has changed its course over time, it has gradually eroded away parts of the tell, so that only about a third of the ancient city is still remaining. And here you can see again the sort of shape of the tell that reflects that erosion. What that means, though, is interestingly, the side facing the river has an escarpment that is, right on the edge. You've got buildings that are sort of standing out from the side of the tell, walls that stick out. There we go. By 1983, much of the area that had been dubbed Area C, which you can see on this plan, had been excavated at the edge of the tell, though the archaeologists had not dug very deeply. Many ancient stratigraphic layers still lay untouched beneath the exposed walls, and that's still true. They haven't excavated lower than where they did in the late 70s and early 80s. In the meantime, in season 8, we were beginning to work in Area F, which you can see circled here on the slide. And this is a team picture taken that year. You can see site director Giorgio Buccellati standing in the back of our group. He's on the right. And I wasn't going to say this, but I'm wearing the T-shirt that says jazz on it. And my husband, Jerry, is sitting right next to me. He's here. He was, for some weeks of the excavation, he came out. He's a conservator of antiquities, and he came out to be the site conservator on the excavation, helping to restore the objects that were found and preserve them. And we were very young. We don't look like that anymore. So although working on this excavation was fascinating, I was most interested in the cuneiform tablets that were found there. And I planned to do my PhD dissertation on the social relationships of the people of Terka and of the kingdom of Hana as reflected in these documents. Now, this seemed possible because many things had changed since Ugnad had published that first text relating to Pagyrum in 1909. To start with, by 1983, dozens more of these Hana cuneiform tablets had joined those first 4. Back in 1924, François Toureau d'Agen, who had published the first 2 of the Hana texts, or 2 of the first Hana texts, and another scholar named Edouard Paul Dorme, led an expedition to Terka to find out more about the ancient city and to search for more tablets. They didn't find any in their 5 days of excavations. They did a lot of digging. They brought in the French army, actually, but they didn't find almost anything in the course of their excavations, perhaps because they were going a little fast. Mud brick walls are a little tricky to find. But they did acquire 7 tablets from 2 French military officers who had found them somewhere. And they were donated to the Louvre Museum. And these were tablets that definitely came from Terka. And 5 of the documents, which are seen here, referred to a man named Gimel Ninkarak, who was described as being the chief barber. These consisted of lists of names and 3 contracts. And they must all have come from a single archive. They have a very similar appearance, very similar style. They clearly belong together. But they weren't properly excavated, so the scholars didn't know where on the tell at Terka they came from. The dated ones were from the reign of a king named Shunukru Amu. Now, we already knew about him because he was the father of Amimadar, who had made the gift of fields to Pagyrum. So that same Pagyrum, amazingly, seems to be named in one of these tablets. He just keeps showing up. He was the scribe who wrote one of the hiring contracts. What were the chances? This Pagyrum seemed to be everywhere. So here were more Hana tablets, and the authors proposed the following order for the kings. Isharlim, then Kashtilyashu, then Hammurapi, then Shunukru Amu, then Amimadar. And of course, Shunukru Amu and Amimadar have to be in that order because they're father and son. Now, Turo, Dajan, and Dorm were no longer sure that Hammurapi was the same man as the king of Babylon, but they were sure that these kings all ruled during the Old Babylonian period, the era that began with Hammurabi's reign, starting in 1792, and ending with the attack on Babylon in 1595. A few other Hana texts appeared in museums and collections in the years between 1910 and 1960, none of them with a secure provenance, but many of them alleged to have come from Terka, and almost all of them with that characteristic Hana set of legal clauses. One of them introduced a new king of Hana named Isik Dagan, and amazingly, his royal seal was on his tablet as well, and it said, gave his title as King of Hana. Two more came from the reign of Hammurapi, and who by 1960, when the latest of these tablets had been published, was clearly not the same king as the king of Babylon. In fact, one of these includes the royal seal of King Hammurapi, and he's described as King Hammurapi of Hana, so clearly he was a different king. And in fact, it turned out that a number of Mesopotamian kings had the name Hammurapi, or Hammurapik, or Hammurabi. There's not just the one. So once formal excavations began at Terka in 1976, more tablets were discovered, and this time they had clear stratigraphic contexts. The area excavated, this area C, proved to be a neighborhood of houses with a small local shrine. And here you can see on this slide, the shrine is on the right. This aerial view on the left includes lots of holes. It looks like Swiss cheese, but those are pits that have been dug down from later levels. So it's not that those pits actually existed in the houses at the time. The cuneiform tablets found in the excavations shone a much clearer light on this period than had been possible before. The tablets found in undisturbed levels all came from the reigns of 5 kings, 3 of them known, 3 previously unknown. I told you there'd be a lot of names. Don't be overwhelmed. It's going to make sense. The new ones were clearly earlier, and they're here on the left. Yahpasumu Abu, Itzisumu Abu, and Yadikabu. Those were all kings that we hadn't encountered before, but the kings Kashtiliashu, Shunukruamu, and Amimadar, they were kings that we knew about previously. In fact, the epigraphist from the excavation, whose name is Olivier Rouault, he was even able to find a synchronism. So we finally have an actual date. There was Yarikabu, the king who ruled at Terka, was known to have fought Samsu-iluna, a king of Babylon, in 1723 BCE. We know this because Samsu-iluna named him in a year name. So there's a point, all this sort of feeling, are we in the right era? We have an anchor. It's not Hammurabi, he's not the king that we find a reference to. It's this tie to a king of Babylon named Samsu-iluna. So 1723, we've got a date. Ugnad had been right all those years ago about at least this. The tablet he published, the one from King Amimadar, was indeed from the Old Babylonian period. So at this point, the consensus was that all these kings of Hana, as they were called, were from the Old Babylonian period. One problem was that 4 of the Hana kings didn't fit into this chronology easily. Isharlim, Isik Dagan, Hammurapi, and the newly discovered king named Igid-lim. They were still kind of floating in the chronology. Were they before Yadikabu? Were they after Amimadar? Were they somewhere in the middle? It was unclear. And curiously, these 4 were the only ones for whom we actually knew their title, the title King of Hana. The old Babylonian ones, they don't have a title on their tablets. We still call them kings of Hana, but we actually don't know what the name of the kingdom was. So before I could begin my analysis of the social relationships at Terka, I had to determine the sequence in which all these tablets were written, especially those ones with the royal seals on them. So I decided to devote the first chapter of my dissertation, this is typical graduate student, right? I'll deal with this in my first chapter, and I'll go on and do the social relationships in the rest of it. Well, that chapter got longer and longer and longer, and it ended up being my entire dissertation. It was just about the chronology, figuring out the chronology of these kings. I finished it in 1988. After that, more evidence appeared, and I have continued to work on the issue of the chronology of Hana, including the 3 works that you see here. In the book, by the way, The Land of Hana, I republished all of the tablets that had been in private collections and had been published in individual studies previous to the time when I was writing it. It came out in 2002, rather. So here, these first published Hana tablets. This is what my puzzle was when I started working on the chronology. How do I make sense of this with these different tablets? And I realized that in order to do the research, I would need to actually go and visit the tablets. I needed to physically go and see them, because this was a time before digitization, long before the internet. You remember, some of you. if you wanted to work on something, you actually physically had to go to it. And so I had to go to Paris, to the Louvre, to see a bunch of them. I went to the Pierpont Morgan Library in New York, where there was a tablet. And there was a tablet in the Vorder Asiatische Museum, the one that I've been talking about, Pagurum's tablet. And this was 1987, and it was not the easiest thing to get to East Berlin. But we went, and we went through Checkpoint Charlie, and it was quite an adventure. But the Syriologist who worked there, whose name was Horst Klengel, was wonderfully helpful, and I got a chance to actually work with this tablet, to have it under a magnifying glass and to hold it in my hands. And when actually seeing these tablets in person, I realized something that had never been clear from the publications, and especially the ones that had only published the autographed copies, because those were in someone else's handwriting. They're not in the scribe's handwriting, they're in the handwriting of the scholar. And he's interpreting, I say he because they were all he at that point, he was interpreting what he was seeing. He wasn't actually showing what was physically on the tablet. When you hold the tablet in your hand, you see so many different things. And what I saw, which you can, I think, pick out in these photos, the ones at the bottom from the reigns of Kashtiliashu and Amimadar, they're tall, they have sharp corners, and they had several seal impressions on the left margin. And they're very much like the ones from the Old Babylonian period Area C at Terka. Even the same style of cuneiform script. They were, rightly, as had always been assumed, they were indeed Old Babylonian. But the tablets on the top, the ones from the reigns of Ishar-Lim at the Louvre, which you see here, and the Hammurapi tablet at the Pierpont Morgan Library, that was the marriage contract, they seemed similar to the others when you looked at them in autographed copies, but seen in person, they were completely different. They, and the tablets from the reign of Isik Dagan and Egid Lim, which you see here, these are those kings that hadn't quite fit into the chronology. They were squarer, they were more pillow-shaped when you held them, they felt like a little pillow. And the script was very different. They were also different in all having an impression of the king's seal on the margin. Only one of those late texts dating to a king named one of the kings dating to text dating to Hammurabi doesn't have a royal seal. All the rest of them do. So I wondered at first, were these differences because you have a set of royal tablets and you have a set of non-royal tablets? But the differences were very marked, even in what we call paleography, even in the handwriting, the ways the scribes formed their signs. Now here I'm getting really, really technical, sorry, but this is the name of Pagurum, written in 3 different tablets. And I think even if you don't read cuneiform, I think you can see the differences in the scripts. I've put a square around his name. The top 2 examples are from Old Babylonian tablets. Top one is from a text found at Terka. The middle one is from a tablet in the Louvre. The signs, they have the same number of wedges, the same angles to the wedges. They're written the same way. At the bottom is the same name, Pagurum, on the marriage contract from the reign of Hammurapi. And you can see that the signs are very different. There's an angularity to them. There's more wedges in the sign for the sound gi, for example. They just look different. And if you think about handwriting in different eras, even in our handwriting, you know how you look at the beautiful copperplate handwriting of a few, maybe 100 years ago, versus our handwriting today? You can see they're not written at the same time. This is the same. If you read cuneiform, these are not written at the same time. This is a different script from a different era. And paleography is a field in cuneiform studies, an increasing field since the 1980s. And there's more and more evidence for how you can date tablets based on their script. So those ones that, and here's another example. Here's the sign Ats, or Az, in a number of different signs. Other signs had changed over time, and I was able to identify these and not only see the difference of the early ones and what were now clearly later ones, but also to even be able to trace changes gradually through those eras, like little wedges had been added to signs or taken away. The signs of the late ones, they were typical of the late Bronze Age, which began around 1500 BCE. So I started looking for comparisons to these late tablets. What did they look like? If they aren't Old Babylonian, when were they? Unfortunately, none of these kings, not one of them, is named in a single tablet from another kingdom. I don't have that nice synchronism like we had with Samsu-Iluna and Yadikabu. 1723, found him. That's not the case with these kings. They weren't mentioned. But in their size and shape, they very much resemble tablets from other sites in Syria that were written between the 15th and the 13th centuries BCE. And here I've got some from a site called Ekalte, another one from Amar, Katna, and Tel Brak. That pillow shape, that sort of roundedness to the shape, even the shapes of the signs, very similar. And so then I just went wild and I compared so many different features. I'm not going to read you this whole list, but I looked at every tablet, not just as a text, but as an object, to sort of look at them as archaeological artifacts that could be seen to have changed over time. And in each one of these characteristics that I looked at, you could indeed see differences between the earlier ones, which were like the ones coming out of Area C at Terca, and what were now clearly the later ones, which were the ones that hadn't yet been found in a stratigraphically untouched context. But just to mention a couple of these, the personal names, for example, that were used in the earliest texts, they are very much like the ones that were used at the city of Mari, which had been occupied a few decades before the beginning of those texts in Area C. The later ones are very different. They were using different names. They had fashions in names back then, just as we do today. There was something called the personal name determinative. This is actually something that I was kind of proud of, that hadn't ever been looked at before. Everyone knew that there was a sort of sign that looks like a number 1 in front of personal names. And what I was looking at was, when did they start using this more commonly? In the very early tablets, there's not many of these personal name determinatives. They only show up very specifically when a name comes right at the beginning of a line. By the latest ones, every time a name appears, there's this personal name determinative. And it was something that scribes did naturally without thinking about it. So it's not something that, you know, a scribe would change if he was doing a different kind of tablet. It's just something that was a habit of writing. It wasn't a sign that was read aloud. It was simply a sign that said, this is a personal name. And again, you could see this increasing number of the personal name determinatives over time. So I was pretty excited about this because all of these in combination showed decisively that those kings with royal seals, those ones who we know had the title King of Hana, did not in fact rule during the Old Babylonian period, but significantly later. Now, just how much later was a surprise even to me. In 1989, after I finished my dissertation, H.M. Kumel published a contract that was clearly of the Hana type, with the same legal phrases that scholars had used all along to assign tablets to the Hana group. So this, if you were to read it, just read the text of it, you'd say, yes, it's a Hana text. But previously, they would have said, yes, it's Old Babylonian. It's got all those same characteristics. But it had a date. And this date was known from other tablets from other regions. And the date was in what we call the Middle Assyrian period, specifically during the reign of King Tukulti-Ninurta I of Assyria, which was in the 13th century BCE, 500 years after the documents in Area C. So this was an exciting moment, I have to tell you, when I first encountered this article about this tablet, because it meant that, you know, I was right, which was a huge relief, but also I was more right than I had thought I was in terms of moving these forward in time. Because one of the tablets we have, which has a king named Amirapi, but it doesn't have a date formula on it, it was so much like the one with the eponym of King Tukulti-Ninurta I from the 13th century that it almost has to be. I mean, it has the same everything, other than it looks a little different because it's a smaller tablet, but it has the same type of script, it has exactly the same legal formulas, it's in the same order, so much is alike, that one has to put this king Hammurapi into the 13th century BCE. Later, I should say that a scholar named Tsukimoto published a text in 2003 that's even later still from yet another Middle Assyrian king from the 12th century BC, and it still has those Hana texts. It still has the formulas that we would expect to see in them. So that means that we have to change our chart considerably. Where previously all of the Hana kings had been thought to be in the Old Babylonian period, now we can see that the kingdom of Hana was in this period from 1500 to 1350, and that there was still being Hana texts being written in the Middle Assyrian period. Here I'm still perhaps conservatively putting Hammurapi into the 14th century, but I think he's probably in the 13th. In the meantime, I should mention, I published this, of course, in 1993 as a finding, and I was gratified to have it largely accepted by other scholars, that indeed the kingdom of Hana wasn't a single sort of century of kings, but that these Hana-type texts actually spread out over 5 centuries. In the meantime, some more tablets had been found at Terca, where they had been stored in ancient times in 2 jars. Now, these haven't yet been published by Rouault, but the documents, he's listed who the kings were who are named in these, and yet more kings are in the list, some of them actually identified as kings of Hana. But I want you to look at the last one on the chart, Pagiru, right? Amazing. It seems that, and this is probably a different one, Pagiru doesn't have an M at the end of his name because by this time, by the 13th century, or 13th or 14th century, they had left the M off the end of most nouns. There was it's called mimation, and there were M's on the ends of nouns. In the Old Babylonian period, they'd taken that sound off the ends of nouns by this time. But it's the same name. It's the same name, Pagirum. It just seems to have been a very common name in Hana for centuries. When only 4 tablets were known in 1909, 1910, from this entire region, it was assumed that the references to Pagirum must have all been to the same man. When we realize now that these 4 tablets represent all that had been found of what must have been thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of documents that were written in that kingdom and that region over 5 centuries, it's clear that it was simply a coincidence that the same name recurred. Just as you might find the name John or George in a text, American document from the 18th century, and you might find the same name today. It's not the same John or George. In fact, these 2 or 3 men named Pagirum, in those 4 early documents, they lived hundreds of years apart. The kingdom of Hana, the later period with kings who definitely had that title, is still only represented by a handful of documents, very few of them from any sort of stratified context. Thousands of these documents must have been written. I mean, every single one of these kings, right? He had an archive, he had officials, he wrote letters. We just don't have them. I do wonder, perhaps, if Terka was no longer the capital city after the Old Babylonian period. These later documents, when they reference a palace, they talk about it being a palace in a place called Bidach, and Bidach hasn't been identified. So perhaps that is where the archives, both royal and private, will eventually be found. At that point, when they find an archive, we will know a great deal more about this kingdom than we do now. This chart, which was made by Olof Pedersen, shows the uneven distribution of cuneiform archives and libraries over time in the ancient Middle East. The y-axis is the number of archives and libraries, and the x-axis is the century, and it goes from the 15th century BCE on the left to the 2nd century BCE on the right. What it shows is that very few documents or archives survive from the 15th century BCE or the 11th or the 9th, and as far as we know, no archives at all from the 10th century BCE. But the late Bronze Age period, that's the 14th to the 12th centuries, that's that first little blip on the chart. This was a time of widespread peace and prosperity, and it's well represented. And that's also true of the period of the Assyrian Empire, which you can see peaking in the 7th century there, towards the end of the Assyrian Empire. But these are just the archives that have been found. The 10th century is often referred to as a dark age because we know so little about it. And this is obvious that from this chart there are just not many documents. Was it really dark, or have we just not found the archives yet? Cuneiform archives are often found in destruction levels, as we saw at Ebla. And many of the other important cuneiform archives, this is true of them too. In such contexts, we often still find them collected together, but only because no one ever went back to retrieve them. They're witness to the end of an era. A person or a family or a city came to an end at this point, or just a building. But in any event, end of something. And buildings are often burned when they're conquered. And so a disproportionate number of archives date to a time of destruction of the relevant city, or even of a whole kingdom. That was true at Ebla. This archive comes from the very end of the history of Ebla in the 3rd millennium BCE, because it was destroyed and conquered. So, one advantage to a burned building for historians, although of course the fire was a tragedy, a disaster for people who lived through it, is that the heat often bakes the cuneiform tablets. And even if they were originally only sun-dried, which was true of most tablets, they didn't bake most of them. But now they're baked because the building burned. And baked tablets are like fired bricks. They are indestructible. They are so, there's not much you can do with them. So sun-dried bricks also survive pretty well in the ground, and we do find a lot of them if they're simply abandoned. But not every cuneiform document is lying there in the ground waiting to be found. Because, and this is a point we often overlook, A cuneiform document is made of very fine clay. You just don't pull clay out of the ground in that beautiful state. It had to be washed, it had to be rinsed, it had to be tempered. It had making the clay for a cuneiform tablet was a project, and they could be recycled. And the Mesopotamians were great recyclers. They recycled metal, that's why we don't find very much of it. And they seem to have probably recycled cuneiform tablets as well. If they were sun-baked, kept them for as long as they were useful. Once they were no longer useful, you could moisten them, you could put them in a recycling bin. We find tablet recycling bins on excavations, often in scribes' houses. And then you could scrape them down, reuse them. So that's one reason why we find these archives from burned palaces usually reflect only a decade or so before of the period before the palace was destroyed, that the earlier documents tend to have been presumably recycled. But a baked clay tablet could not be recycled, and so it survived through all the millennia since then to today, and will probably continue to survive for millennia to come. Honestly, they're going to outlive our books. I think it's these clay tablets. 5,000 years in the future, people are still going to be reading clay tablets, and they'll look at books from 2023 and have nothing. I don't know about digital stuff. I'm not sure if that's going to survive. So we therefore have these active archives when you find a big collection like this. Earlier records seem not to have been kept much. In palaces and temples, they were probably recycled after a while, unless they were of particular importance to the administration. But active archives could still be huge. And when a palace or temple has been excavated with such an archive, its contents come to dominate cuneiform studies. Each time that one of these has been found, they've created a whole new sort of field of cuneiform and a whole new spotlit sort of area in that giant warehouse of Mesopotamian history, as scholars have published and analyzed the documents and recreated the world in which they were written. This results in an odd phenomenon in my field, that certain periods and places are disproportionately represented among those 500,000 known tablets. For example, there's a site called the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative that lists all of the sites that have found tablets, and there are 58 of them across the Middle East, and they're tabulated here. But some of the sites have vastly more tablets than others. So you see the first 8 all have more than 10,000 tablets that have been found there, and the rest of them have thousands, or in some cases, toward the end of the list, only hundreds. One site, Pusrish Dagon, for example, had many, many more than 10,000 tablets, and in just a 68-year period of history is represented by 120,000 tablets, 68 years towards the end of the 3rd millennium BCE. Now, if you think about, we've got 500,000 tablets, 500,000 tablets. A quarter of them come from a 168-year period. That's how disproportionate it is. So let's go back to Pagirum. I want to finish this with looking at Pagirum and his world. At last, we can finally sort of look at the world in which he lived. The tablets from Area C at Terka all have the same people in them. They reflect, we find the same names recurring over and over again. And what this struck me is that this was a perfect opportunity to use them to do a microhistory. Now, microhistory is an approach to history that is common in other fields, but hasn't been used very much in the field of Assyriology. One exception is this scholar who described it. He was doing a microhistory, and he says it's an analytical approach employing a reduced scale of observation for the intense study of select texts to reveal information previously unseen or considered unattainable, and it allows concrete individual or local experience to re-enter history. Another definition from Jill Lepore: microhistorians, tracing their elusive characters through slender records, tend to address themselves to solving small mysteries about a person's life as a means to exploring the culture. This is exactly what one can do with cuneiform tablets. We have these little pieces of life. We might have an archive, as we do at Terka, of only a few dozen tablets, but they reflect the same group of people. We can look at them in a microhistorical way. And Pagurum's a perfect example of this. Now I'm going to do a plug for my book, bear with me, because this is what I did in my book, Weavers, Scribes and Kings, that Larry kindly mentioned at the beginning. What I decided to do is to do a series of microhistories of people from all walks of life. It begins with a man named Kushim, who was the organizer of the beer warehouse in the city of Uruk around 3100 BCE. Writing had only just been invented, and we know a number of things about him. He was bringing in grain and beer, and he was very bad at math. His math wasn't very good. Honestly, they have a base 60 of their numerical system. I'm not very good at it either. But Most scribes were much better at it than Cushing was. My book ends in the 4th century BCE with a man who was a physician and an exorcist. He was working to keep cuneiform writing alive at a time when it was dying out, when the Aramaic language and script had largely taken over in Mesopotamia. And in between, I have many men and women who held different professions and had varying life experiences. And 3 of the microhistories are of people who lived in Terca at different times. So let's look briefly then at the microhistory of Pagyrum and the people who lived around him. The first reference we find to him was in a text that's listed here as TFR 16 on the slide. And this was a document that was found in an archive of a man named Puzerum, who lived across the street from the shrine that I showed you. And we do, by the way, I should say, for this period, there does seem to have been just one man named Pagyrum. For this Old Babylonian period, we don't seem to have a multitude of Pagyrums at this point. These all seem to refer to the same guy. Whereas the ones who lived later and had caused so much confusion, those were different men. So what we see from Pagyrum in this document was that he was... It wasn't him, in fact. It's a reference to someone who seems to have been one of his ancestors, because in text 6, the scribe is someone named Sin-nadin Shumi. Now, we know that Sin-nadin Shumi was the name of the father of a man named Baculum, and you remember, Baculum was the father of Pagyrum. So Sin-nadin Shumi in this tablet seems to have been Pagyrum's grandfather. A generation later, oh, this is just to show you where we are. So we have, you can see that Puzerum's house, where that document was found, is in the bottom right. The shrine of the goddess Ninkarak is opposite it across the street. And the probable house of Gimel Ninkarak, who was the chief barber, is next to the shrine. So what we find then, a generation later, the king Kashtiliashu was in power, and by now Pagyrum was a grown man, and we find his own name for the first time. It appeared on the tablet shown on this slide, which was excavated in that shrine to the goddess Ninkarak, the goddess of healing, which was across the road from Puzerum's house. Other objects in the shrine are a small bronze dog. Now, the dog was the symbol of the goddess Ninkarak, and a hoard of 7,000 beads made of all sorts of semi-precious stones like carnelian and lapis lazuli, hematite, rock crystal. And they'd been placed apparently in a bag and buried under the altar. So even though this is a small neighborhood shrine, this is an enormous amount of wealth that had been dedicated to the goddess. The offering list in the middle, seen here, included Pagyrum's name, and it lay on a plastered floor next to the door shown in this reconstruction. And the door was still actually, it still had its top when they excavated it, the door within the shrine. And it was pierced at the top, this tablet, so that it could have been suspended and displayed. And the men listed on it are a microcosm of this community. And I wrote a recent article on this document identifying the men and how they were connected to one another, because you can really see that this was a community by comparing this tablet with all the ones around it. Gimel Ninkarak, the chief barber, is listed near the top. It was probably a hierarchical list, because we have the goddess Ninkarak, who comes first. She was the recipient of the offerings. Then the king, it just says the word the king, it doesn't name him, but we know it was Kashtiliashu from the year name at the end. And then a high-ranking man named Yasu Dagan, then Gimel Ninkarak, the barber. At the very end of the list comes Pagyrum, and perhaps at this point he was just a young man, perhaps a teenager, and he's described as being a musician. These men belong to 4 prominent families that I've been able to reconstruct from the tablets at Terca. The tablets showed that they lived near one another, they witnessed one another's contracts, they bought houses and fields from one another, they farmed adjoining lands. And the families probably intermarried as well, but women are rarely mentioned, so we can't be sure. So Pagyrum was a musician. What did that mean? Well, we know that he could have played a number of musical instruments, which are known from this time period. Harps, lyres, lutes, drums, cymbals, flutes. These are all known. And these clay plaques that I'm showing you are not from Terca, but they're from the same period at other sites in Mesopotamia, showing musicians. And these ones show male musicians, which have been more like Pagyrum, but they're also images of female musicians. And the city of Mari, which was just on the Euphrates from Terca, a few decades earlier, there are tablets describing, well, not describing, but listing musicians who lived at the palace of Mari, and they were mostly women. These were women who would have performed at banquets in the palace, and who would also have been part of the accompaniment of rituals in the temples. Music was very important to the Mesopotamians. They loved music. By the time the next king ruled in Terka, Shunakruamu, Pagirum was now working as a scribe, perhaps following in the footsteps of his grandfather, Sin-nadin Shumi, who had probably written the earlier document that I mentioned. Professions did tend to run in families. Now, the image on the left is from a much later period, the Neo-Assyrian period, but it's one of the few representations we have of a scribe holding his clay tablet in his left hand and his stylus in his right. I always have my students practice writing on cuneiform tablets. I mean, I give them clay and a stylus. Turns out it is very hard to be left-handed if you are a cuneiform writer. My left-handed students have real trouble making the wedges because they all are very much sort of slanted towards the way they would be if you were right-handed. On the right, you can see just how small some of these tablets were. This shows the minuscule writing that Pagirum would have been able to produce. And these two tablets were in fact written by Pagirum. They were found, one was the list of offerings that I've already shown you, another is a contract for the hire of a laborer. That was the first one. And then the other one is for the purchase of a field. And that was one of the tablets that's been recently published by Olivier Rouault. So he's a scribe. What does that mean? He went to school. Scribes went to school, and we have evidence of their education in their exercise tablets, which are found in the Old Babylonian period in many sites. And we know that the scribes, the schools they went to generally were in the town in which they lived, and they were tended to be in a scribe's house. So they weren't going to a big institution, they would have been going to someone's house to learn. And the curriculum was remarkably consistent. Across time and across Mesopotamia, they did the same exercises in school. It started out with just trying to write signs, and the text on the left-hand side is a scribe's early exercise tablet. He's got big wedges that he's impressing into the clay, and it's a little clumsy. Over time, they got better and better, and they would start writing words, nouns, names, proverbs, and then gradually they would go on to writing actual texts that they would copy from a version that the scribal master, the teacher, had given them. They all moved on to mathematics, and on the right-hand side is a mathematical prism, which lists 8 different word problems in mathematics. And Mesopotamian mathematics in this period was remarkably advanced. They were quite aware of the Pythagorean theorem. There are clay tablets to prove it. Unfortunately, as far as we know, it was forgotten, and Pythagoras did rediscover it. So we can't claim that he learned it from the Mesopotamians. It seems as though it was not remembered for some period after this. But they understood it. They were good at geometry. And he would have learned this as well. They also practiced writing model letters, writing contracts. And since most people were still not literate, scribes had a high position in society. Some became palace or temple employees, some served as diviners or priests, some were merchants, and the highest officials of the kings would have been trained as scribes. And the buildings in Area C, this is a sketch of the region that was drawn by Renata Liggett in 1982 and published. These were familiar places to Pagirum. It's amazing when visiting there to stand on those streets and stand in those buildings and think, this is actually where they were. He walked the streets, he gave offerings at the temple, he sat with the elderly Gimel Ninkarak in his house while writing out his contract. He probably chatted in the town square next to the temple with friends, and he might have been accompanied by his son, who we know was named Idinadu. Although Pagirum's own house has not been discovered, we know that his neighbors tended to live in the same houses for generations, passing down the property from father to son. We know they purchased fields near Terka, hired laborers to help with the farming, and took on loans, perhaps for seed grain or farming equipment. Puzurum's house had a pantry full of storage pots, one of which held some spices, including cloves, which must have come all the way from Southeast Asia. They represent the earliest evidence of such a distant contact. Terka was a busy place, economically thriving and in touch with a wide network of trade contacts. We know little about the political history of Terka in this era, beyond the names of its local kings, but its social and economic world can be vividly reconstructed through a microhistorical study like this. And so we return to the tablet with which I started this talk. Pagirum had lived through the reigns of at least 2 kings, Keshtiliashu and Shunakruamu. In the first year of a new king, Amimadar, Pagirum, who must have been elderly by this time, was singled out for an honor. He was given a royal bequest of 3 fields. Was this perhaps because he had served the kings as a scribe? We don't know, but it's quite possible. This is the last we hear of him, though perhaps other tablets remain to be found that will tell us more. New advances in technology are providing scholars with many new resources for the study of cuneiform tablets. And I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about these in the question and answer period. But for me, it always comes back to the importance of the people in the documents, we find that all those hundreds of thousands of tablets, they are tangible relics of the lives of real people. Pagirum held this tablet in his hand. It isn't a later copy. It's not like when you look at documents that have been copied and copied and copied, say from Greek times, and the copies that we have are hundreds of years after the original. This is the one that was written during his lifetime. We even have tablets in his own handwriting that I showed you, bearing his fingerprints. They are as immediate to his life as a signed deed to a house or a rental agreement is to us today. They're just 3,700 years older. Microhistory allows us to settle in with Pagirum and his neighbors for a little while and to get a sense of their world. There are thousands of other such stories from the ancient Middle East. The wealth of knowledge we have about the people who lived then only continues to grow all the time, and the cuneiform tablets on which they wrote provide a uniquely intimate view of their world. Thank you.
We have time for questions.
Hello, I'm David Rosen, lifetime member of PSW. I want to, okay, first of all, those fields at Pagirum, what did people grow on it? What was the food? And second of all, this Dark Ages. You said that Babylon had been conquered. By who?
Oh, those are good questions. Yes, I've been writing this lecture, and it got longer and longer and longer, so I took some things out. So I'm really glad you're asking questions of things that I had taken out. The fields were largely used to grow barley, some wheat, but mostly barley, and perhaps that was because barley resists salty soil better than wheat does, as I understand it. But barley was definitely their major crop. But they would also have gardens where they grew lots of onions and leeks, and they really liked garlic, things like that. And vegetables, they had lots of green vegetables. They would grow chickpeas. They also, for sugar in their diet, they had dates from the date palms. So it was a pretty good diet. They didn't eat an enormous amount of meat. They had animals that they herded, but they tended to keep them alive because they were more used to them alive than dead, and obviously had no refrigeration. But they would eat fish from the rivers and wild birds, so that was sort of made up their diet. And your other question was about the, remind me? Oh, who conquered them? Yes, who conquered? Right. So this is, oh gosh, I could go on for another hour. 1595, it used to be thought that it was the Hittites who came down the Euphrates and just wiped out Babylon in one fell swoop. But a scholar named Suzanne Paulus has done some really interesting work on this, and she's found evidence from a number of texts that there was a lot of people who were blamed for the fall of Babylon. The Kassites, for example, the Canaans, and the Canaans are from Hannah, those are my guys. The Amorites were blamed, even though the Amorites had been living in Mesopotamia for a very long time. The Hittites certainly did come down the Euphrates from Anatolia and sort of deliver the coup de grace, but it was a long process that Babylon had been weakening for some time before that. But the Hittites, when they came, they stole the statue of the city god and took it back with them, which was a major diplomatic problem. But interestingly, resolved diplomatically. There's another text that suggests that there was a diplomatic envoy who went north to Hatti and managed to negotiate for the return of the city god.
Colin Alberts, I'm also a member. I was scratching my head a little bit about the timeline that you had there, and I'm trying to put it in the larger context. You mentioned the Dark Age, which was in the 16th century, and then there's that period in the 10th century where there just aren't any tablets being found. Neither of those periods really sort of jibe with the late Bronze Age collapse that we're usually used to in like Greece and Egypt and Ascalon and places like that. And they also didn't result, it looks like it doesn't result in the loss of literacy, for sure. I mean, I guess it's the same language before and after. But my question is that, you know, you say we don't know a lot about their politics, but we do know a lot about their economics. Would it be fair to characterize the pre-Dark Age as like a palace economy? Or is it different from that? Because, you know, there are a lot of people that are saying the late Bronze Age collapse elsewhere was really kind, you know, palace economy is like a plantation economy, and it was more of an uprising than a conquering. And are they saying that, you know, you talk about the conquerors, or, you know, there's been a lot of debate about that. Some people are even saying that the Dorians didn't exist, and I'm wondering if anybody is making the same argument about them.
Okay, we have two different periods. 1595 was the conquest of Babylon. That certainly was a conquest. The 12th century, end of the Bronze Age, that's a different one. So we've got two different dark ages, one at the end of the conquest of Babylon, and then another one hundreds of years later that was after the supposed sea peoples and all of that discussion. Yeah, there's a lot of talk about that. I would defer to my colleague Eric Klein on that one, and I know he's spoken here. He's written extensively on it. What happened, though, is you're right, literacy was not lost. There is quite a lot of documentation right up to that period where you get the sea peoples perhaps moving in, maybe the rebellions from within palaces, who knows, Trojan War, you know, all kinds of stuff going on in that same period at the end, the 12th century. But they did remember how to write, because they were still writing in the same cuneiform system. And probably there's more archives that are just missing, that they were continuing. It's because people didn't go away. You know, there were still people. They may have abandoned the major cities, but they were still alive, and they're presumably keeping the scribal tradition alive. But where we normally find, and as you say, this sort of question about palace economies, most documents tend to come from palaces, and one of the reasons for that is that's what tends to be excavated. You know, if an archaeologist is going, and especially in the mid 19th to the mid 20th centuries, that's what archaeologists went to look for. They were looking for palaces and temples. So when they excavated and then found tablets, they found tablets that reflect an economy dominated by palaces and temples. But if you look in periods where you excavate more private houses, there's documents in those too. So I think especially by the Old Babylonian period, there was much less of a domination of the economy by the palace and temple. The question is, how dominant were they before? The third dynasty of Ur, for example, which was in the late 3rd millennium BCE, 2100-ish, they were, it looks like a very, very centralized economy, but there are certain scholars who say that's just because that's who had the domination of the, you know, of the literacy and who has been excavated. Perhaps it wasn't so centrally dominated by the palace. And I think that's one of the things we always have to be wary of, is we are subject to the accident of excavation. If tablets aren't found, we can't draw any conclusions about them. When they first published the 1897 tablet from Hana, that was the first tablet found in Syria. Up until then, they assumed Syria was free of cuneiform texts. We now know there's hundreds of thousands of them that have been found since. And so I think that excavation is, as it continues over the future centuries, I'm sure they'll find much more, and they'll look back at what we said and go, ha, they thought that was a dark age, were they crazy? You know, I mean, who knows? They may find some evidence that we don't have. So I hesitate to make broad statements about that kind of thing.
Yes, I'm Richard Talbot. I'm a proud member of PSW. Back in late 1980s, there was an article in Science News concerning the creation of little tokens, cones, cubes, rectangles that represented barley and wheat and whatever, okay? They were put inside the envelope. And then the cuneiform was written on the outside. It was an obscene length of time before they realized that they didn't need to make those little tokens and they could just go with the written text on the outside of the envelope. So for those of us who are trying to introduce new technologies, it would be interesting to know how long that period of time was, and if you could put that into context with your research.
Yeah, absolutely. So the woman who published that article was Denise Schmant-Besserat, and she really made an important contribution to the understanding of the beginnings of writing. And yes, they were used from 6000 BC at least. These tokens were used. But the thing is that they were not writing, and they were not, nobody using them was thinking, oh, maybe in 4,000 years we'll come up with writing. They were a perfectly good system of administration that worked for them. Each of the little tokens represented a commodity, so one sheep, one cow, one bushel of wheat. You enclose them in a ball of clay, and you have a record of what you own or what you're sending somewhere else. You seal it on the outside. At this point, they weren't writing on the outside. They were just sealing them. they would then send it somewhere, or they would keep it in their storage, and then they would have a record of what they had. It was a memory aid. It was simply a way of remembering some number of commodities. And think about how hard it is to memorize numbers and nouns, right? Very, very difficult. If you're trying to remember them over 10 years, you've got this little memory aid. You break open the ball, it's called a bula, and you look at the tokens, go, oh, look, I had 6 sheep then, I have 20 sheep now, my sheep herd has grown. It wasn't. The move towards writing happened when they started to press the tokens on the outside. I have no idea why they did. As you say, it's been working for thousands of years. But they started pressing them on the outside so that they had a record for what was on the inside, I think. And then they realized you don't really need the inside, because if the outside has the record, you don't have to do this whole thing of baking them on the inside. And then, again, very slowly, they started to draw things. So they put a number, like the number 3 little lines, and then they would, or 3 little round circles, more likely, and then they would draw a little, head of a cow, and that was 3 cows. But it's not writing. It's not writing at all. It's not representing language. It's just keeping track of stuff. And that's where it stayed again for a long period of time. It wasn't until they realized that the words that they were writing had sounds, and those sounds weren't necessarily only representing that noun. So, for example, the word in Sumerian for to return is the word gi, which also is the word for a reed. So if you draw a reed, like a plant, you could also write the word gi, meaning to return. And so if you're doing these administrative documents, I mean, they weren't documents, they were just pieces of clay with numbers on them, and you wanted to say this had been returned, you could write gi and it meant return. And that it becomes beginning of using it phonetically, using it as a syllabic sound rather than as an image of a noun, as it were. And again, slow process. They went from that, and they still, long after they'd invented what we think of as writing, they still just used it for administration. Hundreds of years. And nobody thought, oh, I've got this, I'm going to write a hymn. It's not at all. It was just the slowest process. And at each point in it, we have to remember that they didn't know writing was coming. It's not like they were thinking, come on already, let's get writing underway. Their system worked fine. It's just like, remember life before cell phones, right? I mean, most of you do. How did we live? How did we get places and not call people and say, I'm here, and play games in Starbucks? We didn't have them. We didn't miss them because we didn't have them. It was the same with writing. They weren't anticipating writing. It wasn't that they were terribly slow getting to it. It was just a stage of number of stages that ultimately resulted in it. And once they had it, eventually, yes, they used it for like royal inscriptions and contracts and eventually literature, but that took a while.
Timothy Thomas, I'm a member of the Society. I now perceive that this is a phonetic syllabic language. Therefore, you can probably read that tablet out loud. Would you do that for us?
Oh my gosh. Seriously? Okay, first may I correct something. One is that it is not a phonetic, it's not a syllabic language, it's a syllabic script. And I think it's very important to keep the distinction between them, because all languages obviously are phonetically spoken. But the difference is, and let me answer this first, and then I will, probably not.
Give it a try.
I can read parts of it, but the difference is that in cuneiform, some of the signs that were originally words, whole words, like gi, right, and they had a sound, meant that they could also be used as a syllable, but the syllable didn't preclude also still using it as a word. So even in very advanced cuneiform, hundreds, thousands of years after it was invented, some of the signs are used still for whole words. Some of them are used for consonant vowel syllables, some for vowel consonant syllables, some for consonant vowel consonant syllables, and they did 2 other things with the signs, one of which is that they used them as what are called phonetic complements. So if you have a word and you put a sign next to it, it told you how to read that word. It wasn't a sign that you actually read aloud, it was just a clue to how to read the word. And another one with these determinatives, like the one I said for personal names. And to add to the confusion, the same signs could be used as determinatives, whole words, phonetic complements, and syllables, and sometimes, often, for multiple syllables. So it makes it a difficult language to, difficult script to read, because, and also it was used to represent many different languages. So if I go to that tablet, to my tablet, I'll just show you, it's not really big enough to be able to, oh, I need to go back to the very first slide where we have it in, yeah, where you can see the script. But, So it starts out with the size of the field. Sorry, going all the way back. And it has, it starts out with, there we go. Okay, so it starts out with numbers, and then it says Asha, and that Sha sign is actually the Sha-3 sign. And so Sha, there are 3 different signs for the sound Sha, and this is the 3rd most common sign. But Asha-3 always means field. And then it gives it says the irrigation district within which it was located. And then there's more information about the irrigation district. And then it says Us Sa Du Anta, and that means the upper long side of the of the field, and it goes on to tell you what's there, and then it says it belongs to so and so, and it has the Dumu sign, and gives the person's name who was the father of that person. So but each one of these is sort of used in a different way. So Ussadu Anta is not actually in Akkadian, it's in Sumerian.
Wait, red microphone.
Oh, what, the sound of it?
Yeah, what's it sound like if you're listening to Babylonian?
Oh, gosh. That's actually really hard, because when we read it, we don't read it necessarily immediately into Akkadian. It's like, I can't do anything off the top of my head in terms of getting it into Akkadian.
Not so easy is what.
Oh, no, absolutely not so easy. Yeah. It's a process. When we read them, we're reading first off what the actual signs are, and then we have to figure out what Akkadian word is represented by that sound, and then what case or verb form that Akkadian word is in, and only then can we make it sound anything like what they.
Let's go to another question.
I wanted to ask another question about actually the script in cuneiform. This existed for 2,500 years. How many different eras were they were really almost a different language? And I presume you can speak everything, but how many people in the world can? How many people in the world can understand, cuneiform? And is there any kind of a movement to, when you find things that aren't fired, like tablets that somehow were preserved, that weren't fired, do you fire them?
Okay, lots of questions. The script was used for multiple languages, and those languages did change over time. And so early texts were largely written in Sumerian, and later they used it for Akkadian. Later it was adapted to be used for Hittite. It was adapted to be used for Hurrian. There's a number of languages that were written in cuneiform. And no, I don't read all of them by a very long way, no. Had I done my degree in Near Eastern languages and cultures, I would have had to learn maybe 5, but I did it in history, so I only needed to learn 3. And one of them I never use. But yes, and they changed over time, even in looking at the script as well. So that the script, if I read the mid-2nd millennium texts, if I'm handed an early 3rd millennium document, I would have to go back to my notes to be able to read those signs. I don't use them. So, it's like, can you read, the Gutenberg Bible? If we read in English, and we're used to reading the Latin alphabet, even Shakespeare in the first folio, maybe, I don't know, that still looks really kind of like what we read. But the way that the handwriting has changed, this is paleography, isn't just a thing for cuneiform. Historians who do colonial US history have to learn paleography. They have to learn how people wrote in that period. So it's an important part of doing history.
Yeah, so lots of questions from the web. Question from Jim Van Artstelen, who's a member. How's AI being used to decipher the cuneiform tablets? There was maybe a recent article in Smithsonian.
Question du jour.
Could it be used to find all the references to Pagarum?
I didn't catch the second one. What was the second question?
Could
it be used to find all references?
All references to Pagarum.
Ah, interesting. Okay, well, AI machine reading of cuneiform has begun. There's a group at the University of Ankara in Turkey, a Turkish team, who are using it to try and read Hittite. And that's very, very recent. I just got that news a month or 2 ago. And it's just in its very beginning phases of trying to to read. And Hittite, in a way, is easier to read, I think, will be easier to read than Akkadian or Sumerian, because Akkadian and Sumerian were intertwined. The Akkadian writers would use what we call sumerograms, in throughout as abbreviations. And I think AI is going to have a bit of a harder time with that, because as I say, the same signs could be used for so many different reasons in different places by different scribes. But it's quite possible that Hittite will be, knock on wood, I hope for them, that the Turkish team will be successful. Because it would be wonderful, because in answer to the other question, which I didn't get to, in terms of how many people are trained to read it, not many. I mean, it's a labor of love to learn it, and it's tough. I have students who want to learn cuneiform sometimes, and I start teaching them, and they're like, wow, it's not just learning the signs, there's so much grammar and different languages, and there's a lot to it. So I think if at some point it's possible to at least get AI to help with the reading of the tablets, that would be amazing. As for all the references to pagyram, well, there's so many pagygrams. It turns out at the site of Mari, which is south of Terka, there's even more pagygrams. It's like, do we want to know who all the Johns are? All the Freds. There's a lot of people with the same name, and at some point it went through this phase of popularity, especially in the Middle Euphrates region. So when Ugnad published it and thought this is an unusual name, at the time it was, because they didn't have any more Syrian tablets. But now we know it's pretty common.
Okay, great. Another question from AJ Kathari. Around 1400, there was a treaty between the Akkadians and the Mitanni, which mentioned the names of Vedic Indian gods, including Indra, Naksha, etc. What do you think that meant?
Oh, okay. It's that treaty is actually, I think, between the Hittites and Mitanni. It is interesting. Yeah, there's a list of gods. Gods of the two lands, and the Mitanni gods include a couple of gods that are recognizably Sanskrit names. And it's actually a bit of a mystery, because the Mitannian kings have Indo-Aryan names as well. So they're not, they spoke Hurrian. We know that the language that these kings spoke at home was Hurrian, but when they took the throne, they took these names which are recognizably related to Indo-Aryan, which is the background of Sanskrit. There's a lot of question about why. Don't know. One possibility is that there was a group of people who shared a background with the people who ultimately lived in northern India, who were living in Syria at that time. We don't have records of them particularly, because they, as I say, the royal family were Hurrian, and they just took these names. But I don't have a good answer. It's one of the things that's unsolved and fascinating.
My name is Al Ehrlich. I am a member. I'm trying to grasp this material in terms of a context. Am I learning only about the upper sliver of society, and that the great mass of the population has no tokens, no property, nothing, and are just toiling in the fields for the others? Or is there more of a communal spirit? Is there more of a communal spirit to this whole thing? And what's the population density, and how deep did the cities get? I mean, Atlanta underground is already 50 feet deep or something like that.
The question about the people who were actually mentioned in the texts. The people who were writing the text were definitely the elite, yes. If you were a scribe, you were rich. What's really wonderful is those administrative texts, actually, which look dull, but they list the rations that were given to all kinds of workers. And so in my book, actually, I have quite a lot of people who were not elite, who I've discussed. That's what it's called weavers, scribes, and kings for a reason. We've got weavers who were not elite people, but their names are mentioned in the tablets, and how much grain they were given as a ration. And they can be traced over time as people who moved up in the ranks of the workers. The vast majority of people were farmers, of course, because, most of human history that was true. Some of them owned their farms, some were tenant farmers. A lot of people were given the use of land by the king so that they would, it was called their ilku, or ilkum, and it was a way for them to support their families, and then they would also do service for the king. So they would be called up on military campaigns if he was going to war. They would be called up to work on his canal constructions or building constructions. But they seem to have lived a decent life because they had land to support them. They had enough land to support their families. And that was a vast number of people in the population. So you don't get sort of abject poverty for the most part, as far as we can see, that there was a sort of safety net that was involved in supporting the state because it was...
These parcels of land, it's not forever.
No, the land wasn't granted forever. It was granted for the lifetime of the person who was doing the ilkum, who was doing these responsibilities. But his son often took it over. And in fact, there's, oh gosh, I could read my book. I'm sorry, no. But there's a really fascinating section that I wrote about that is a man named Shamash Hazir, who was the person who administered these lands, these Ilku lands. And he got letters from King Hammurabi in which Hammurabi was saying, I just heard from a gardener, and he's been told, he told me that his land was taken away from him, but he has a right to it because he's been working it for a long time. Get it back to that gardener and take it away from the person you just gave it to. And Shamash Hazir was keeping track of a massive amount of land with all these different responsibilities that people had on that land. And it seems to have been a system that worked, actually.
Last question. What were the population densities?
Oh, yeah. Don't know. We only can judge population. Actually, there's a chance that this is going to change with remote sensing because they're beginning to look at sites. This has just happened recently for the site of Lagash in southern Mesopotamia. Using remote sensing, they can see how densely occupied it is. And it's actually more densely occupied than we thought because every one of these sites is only a little tiny bit of it is actually excavated. And so the guess was, have we excavated the part people were living in and there was a whole empty part? Didn't know. But looking at remote sensing, they're beginning to see that it was actually quite densely occupied, which will make it possible to make much better estimates of population. But it's just starting. We don't know.
Thank you.
Excellent. Hi, my name is Andy. I have a follow-up to the AI question, but slightly different. You had noted the physical differences between the tablets and how it had taken, decades of time to realize that certain ones should be clumped together and certain ones should not. Separate from the question of using AI to search for strings of text, is there are there digital tools being used to group tablets together in the way that you did so painstakingly? Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, at the University of Helsinki, there's a group that's headed by Sanna Sverd, and she and her team are doing a lot of really interesting work on this, where they are taking, there's a website called the Open Richly Annotated Cuneiform Corpus, which is called ORAC for short, and they've put an enormous number of texts, not like CDLI, where you can actually see the text. They've done what's called the transliterations, where each text is written out in Akkadian. They have looked at texts on ORAC, hundreds, maybe thousands of them, to look for exactly what you're talking about. They're looking, in some cases, for social networks, so that they can see who was, in contact with whom. But they're also looking at what words show up in context with other words, so that so if a particular verb is always found with a particular noun, it helps us understand the meaning of that verb in a more nuanced way. And the machine, the digitizing of it, makes it much more reliable than what we can do as individual scholars, because I have a fairly small corpus. I could do this, by hand. But obviously it gets completely out of control when you've got thousands of tablets, and that is something that they're doing with machine learning, and it's really effective. They're really wonderful work.
Yeah, so more online questions from Shravan Rao. Can the Amama letters from 1300s BC Egypt tell us anything about the Hannah, or was it too far east?
I wish. The Amarna letters from that period they're such a treasure trove. I mean, they're letters between these great kings writing to one another, and they are so much fun to read because the kings were snarky, and they were, but at the same time they were best friends, they were allies. But the kings who weren't in Egypt were always wanting gold from Egypt, and Egypt was always not quite giving enough of it. And so these letters are full of things like, you haven't sent me enough gold, and I just sent you, lapis lazuli or whatever. But they were good friends, and they didn't go to war against one another. And it's an amazing period. It's like 200 years where there was very little warfare and lots of diplomacy. But no, they don't mention Hannah, and I think nobody mentions Hannah. This is one reason why people were saying, oh, it must be Old Babylonian, because, but it's not mentioned in the Old Babylonian period either, and yet it clearly was a kingdom. And It must have been, though, and I think the person who asked that question is right, it must have been subject to one of the great powers at that time. You couldn't really be independent of them. And we thought for a while it was Mitanni. I am now inclined to think it's probably Babylonia, actually, that they would have been more likely to be subject to, because some of the most recently discovered tablets use Babylonian month names, and they have the Babylonian god Marduk mentioned a lot, and the cylinder seals look a lot like Babylonian cylinder seals, Kassite cylinder seals in this time period. So if I were to guess, which I do, my guess, although I haven't actually put it in print, is that I think that it would be more likely to be Babylonia that it was subject to at the time, which was, of course, one of the great powers of the Amarna period. Yeah.
Okay, great. And a question from Eric in Sweden. Are there any excavations going on in Syria right now?
No, not in Syria. There are no excavations in Syria. It's not possible because of the political situation. But there are excavations in Iraq again, and quite a lot. And they're finding wonderful things. So it's exciting to have that start up again. Yes, please.
I think we were talking and we said you didn't find any fiction, you didn't find any prose, but you told us that they love music, and I've seen some of their instruments. You can see them in the University of Pennsylvania Museum and also in the British Museum, among other places. Is there anything on any of the cuneiform tablets that indicates some notation for music?
Yes, actually. Well, I said they didn't write fiction, and that's true. They did write some prose, but it wasn't, you know how fiction today is made up out of the clear blue sky? You know, you come up with Hogwarts out of somewhere if you're J.K. Rowling. They didn't write that kind of fiction. They would write stories about the gods, stories about great heroes from the past, things that have been passed down. And they did write songs, and there is one text from the site of Ugarit, from the 13th century BCE that does seem to have musical notation. And if you go and look it up on YouTube, there are attempts at playing it. And there's been a lot of interpretation of how this represented the strings on probably a lyre or a harp. And it's really interesting to listen to what they've come up with, because if you listen to several different interpreters, they're similar enough to suggest that perhaps they are in agreement, and that's although maybe they listen to one another too, I don't know. But it does seem as though there is some breakthroughs in terms of the understanding what the music sounded like.
Very interesting. Yeah. Last question.
Hugh Rook's not a member. I was also going to ask about hymns or literature, maybe something more specific. Have they found versions of like the Gilgamesh epic in this area, or anything to enrich our understanding of that type of epic cycle or poetry? And it seems like there was a big gap in the kind of research happening around the kind of beginning of the 20th century, and then it kind of picks up again later. Why is there a resurgence, and what kind of explains that gap in the
20th century of our era?
Our era, yeah.
Okay, let me answer the first question first about Gilgamesh. Unfortunately, no, we have no copies of Gilgamesh at Terca. It would be lovely. But there are so many copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh found all over the Near East. There's one in Egypt. Among the question about the Amarna letters, there's a little fragment of the Gilgamesh Epic at Amarna. It's not because everyone had a copy on their nightstand. It's because it's what scribes learned to write in school. And so if you were in school, one of the standard writing exercises was to write the Gilgamesh epic out, or pieces of it. And so sometimes you just find a piece that a student has written out of the Gilgamesh epic. There's two different versions of the epic. One is the Old Babylonian version, and there's a copy of that. Pieces of a copy. It's not complete. They don't have the whole thing, but there are pieces of it from a number of sites. And then there was a scribe whose name was Sin Leki Unini, who was like Homer of the Gilgamesh epic. He was the one who brought it together, probably in the 12th century, somewhere around there, maybe 13th century. And he was the one who wrote this brilliant version that you can read translations of today. That is the more common version. But again, we have big pieces of it missing because scribes didn't copy the whole thing, and it was kept in the library of Ashurbanipal, who was a very important king of the Neo-Assyrian period. And so most of it is known from his tablets. There were 12 of these tablets of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And it must have been well known to people, even though we don't have it from sort of necessarily someone just doing it for reading pleasure. It was certainly well known. Your other question was about, there seems to have been interest in the excavation in the early 20th century and then it stopped. That's actually misleading. That was my presentation, not including, there's been a lot of excavation ever since the mid-19th century of these regions. But often focusing on a number of sites that were excavated for a very long period of time, places like Mari and these sites that have had long, long excavations. No, I don't think there was ever a time when, other than during the World Wars, where the excavations slowed down.
I think that will be it, except for what you can ask and discuss during the social hour. I want to thank Amanda for giving this wonderful talk. Before we go, we have a very few announcements. Well, our next lecture will be the 92nd, is it? Joseph Henry Lecture. It will be on May 19th. The speakers will be, and there are 4 of them, Daniel Innocente, a previous speaker, Melody Yasser, Paul Kessler, and Eleanor Morgan. And they will be talking about space architecture, building systems for life beyond Earth. The 2478th meeting will be on June 2nd. The speaker will be Sean Carroll, who's mentioned at some point tonight. He is the Homewood Professor of Natural Philosophy at Johns Hopkins University, and he's also a member of what is called the Fractal Faculty at the Santa Fe Institute. Somebody may explain to me what that exactly means, but I hope he's all in one piece. He will be speaking about the real Einstein equation, not E equals mc squared, mass, energy, and the curvature of space-time. The 2479th meeting will complete the spring lecture series on June 16th. The speakers will be Bill Merrill and Sam Brody of Texas A&M. They'll be speaking about the $30 billion plus dike project, planned to control rising tides and water surges that threaten to engulf Houston in flooding and storm damage. It is one of the largest civil engineering projects being contemplated in the U.S., and that $30 billion price tag, I can guarantee you it's an underestimate. Please check the PSW website often for up-to-date information on meetings. Before we go, let's thank the people who worked so hard to put this program together and broadcast it and record it. Janice Soreth and Rosemary Collins back there taking care of room management and resets. Cameo Lance, who prepared and read the minutes. Robin Taylor, who you can never see because she's behind the big monitor back there, who does the video, sound, live stream. Connor Nixon for handling the live stream chat. Robert Thompson and Lloyd Mitchell for running the cameras. And Bill Mitchell, who hasn't done anything yet, but will be editing the video. Speaking of crews, anyone who wants to help out, please see me and tell me what you might be interested in doing. Everything that we do is done by volunteers. Nobody is getting paid. So if you're inclined to volunteer and make everybody's load a little lighter, let me know. And with that, I will now adjourn the 2476th meeting of the Society. I wish everyone a good morning, afternoon, evening, or night, wherever you may be. And we'll see you next time. Meeting is adjourned.